improving, and Tania and I didn't really have a chance to catch up and plan for this at all, so we're going to totally wing it live. But I think here, welcome, Tania.
Thank you.
We've had enough conversations where I feel like we can have a conversation. We're going to go for about 15, 20 minutes now. This, for those of you joining us, this again is Elon Goldenberg, senior with J Street. We are at the J Street National Convention here, and we're giving you a flavor of it with word on the street and the shows that we are doing. And so this will continue to go throughout today. And we are now lucky to have with us Tania Hary. Tania runs an organization called Gisha, and has for years, which is just an Israeli human rights organization that really focuses on freedom of movement, and is just one of the most knowledgeable and informed people and organizations on what is happening in Gaza, particularly on the questions of not just humanitarian assistance, but anything going in and out. So Tania, welcome. Why don't you tell us a little bit about Gisha and the work that you are doing?
Sure. So it's great to be here. Thanks for doing this. Gisha means access or approach in Hebrew. We're the only Israeli organization focused on Gaza, and we've been operating for over 20 years now. We do legal work and public advocacy on the issue of freedom of movement and access. So we're helping individuals cross into and out of Gaza. We're monitoring the situation in terms of entry of goods, water, electricity, the situation on the ground.
Yeah, and I should say even long before October 7th, we were having conversations about things like strawberries getting to markets and just the ability of Palestinian society to thrive. I feel like, why don't we start with, where we are today in terms of Gaza, but then also let's go back and talk. Let's start with Gaza and the humanitarian situation and where you see things today and what's happening.
So the situation today, specifically today, is very concerning because the crossings are closed. It's been several days now, of course, because of the escalation in the region. And we're already hearing about aid organizations running out of food or starting to run out of food. Fuel will also run out quickly. And of course, this comes on the backdrop of more than 2.5 years of attacks on the territory by Israel after the devastating attacks by Hamas. There are 2.1 million people living inside of Gaza in less than 50% of the territory. So people are really squeezed in, hemmed in by this yellow demarcation line. Israel uses deadly force to enforce that restriction. And you have people still today struggling to access water, no real sanitation to speak of, the healthcare system in shambles. Food has been getting in a bit more lately, but mainly for the private sector. So most of the population can't afford to buy what's on the market. And so we're still seeing widespread hunger. And like I said, with the crossings closed, that's just likely to increase in the coming weeks and days.
Yeah, and I think that last point is an important distinction because I don't think people always understand it. You have both humanitarian goods that are going into Gaza, and then you have commercial goods that are going into Gaza. And the humanitarian goods are just to feed people, to provide things for free. Those actually are under a much more rigorous set of conditions for what goes in and out versus the commercial, when you see pictures of iPads or cigarettes and all kinds of other things. Also, in addition to food that is being sold, it feels like that system is actually a lot looser. Why? What's with the double standard here?
Yeah, throughout the war, we saw different periods of time where only aid was let in and not private sector goods. But since the ceasefire came into effect, we've seen an increase in private sector goods and really even a prioritization of entry of those goods. So we're still seeing a lot of restrictions on the aid organizations, their inability to get in vital goods that they need, critical humanitarian items, things that Israel considers dual use, where those kinds of items are coming in freely, or not totally freely, but, more freely for the private sector, whether by design or through smuggling. Inability of aid organizations also to move even within the territory. You still need coordination to go from the crossing into the Gaza Strip. And so, from my perspective, I see that as whether it's intentional or not, it doesn't really matter. The outcome of it is that aid organizations are struggling and most of the population needs aid. And I think that Israel has an interest in privileging certain groups over others. So we've definitely seen its strategy to prop up certain kinds of families or clans. And that seems to be what's happening right now on the ground.
And there's also is this question of, dual use items and what is considered a dual use item, which gets abused in some, pretty, frustrating. I'd say even frustrating might be a very light word for it, but maybe talk to folks a little bit about that.
Yeah. So Israel, considers basically thousands of items to be dual use. That means they have both a military and a civilian purpose. There is an official list. Gisha actually fought for many years to have that list published, and then it was published in Arabic and in English. Eventually, those translations were taken down, but Gisha posted them, on our own website. So there is a list. But what we've seen since the war began is basically that Israel has unilaterally decided that thousands more items are even dual use, things that are really vital in a situation where now, 80% of buildings are destroyed, 92% of homes damaged or destroyed. Tent poles have been considered dual use since the start of the war. Sleeping bags, wheelchairs. These are things that were not considered dual use before and have since been designated as such. That doesn't mean that they don't go in, but it means they're heavily restricted and at times have not gone in at all. And so it just completely frustrates the humanitarian response. It frustrates the ability to repair sewage infrastructure, to meet healthcare needs. Everywhere you look, basically, these items are vital and are needed for the population.
I've also read, and correct me if I'm wrong, that there's also been restrictions, for example, on, at least since the war ended or the, major operations, it feels like there's been restrictions on things like school supplies, and also certain food is getting in. So the population is in a much better humanitarian position than where we were, let's say, back in October, but still like some pretty severe limits on the humanitarian food going in.
Yeah. So, the dual use policy and the lack of sort of transparency and coherency behind the policy has created a lot of confusion. So people didn't really understand, certain kinds of food aren't coming in. Does that mean that they're dual use? No. That's part of Israel's broader policy to restrict humanitarian aid. It's basically decided what it considers humanitarian. So for many, many months on end, it would only let in canned food, flour, these kinds of basic items, but not fresh fruit or vegetables, not meat, for example. So, that was part of that policy. Same with educational materials. They're not considered by Israel to be humanitarian. Even hygiene products for women were not considered to be humanitarian. So they were restricted from coming in. It wasn't that Israel was saying these items have a military purpose. It was just part of a broader policy to restrict what was going in, pressure, punish the population, a form of displacement as well, being able to control where people are living inside of the strip. So certain items allowed in to certain areas, but not to others. Yeah.
Yeah. And I also, I sometimes try to understand why you have this. I have this little typology in my own mind that I use sometimes. It's a little simplistic, and maybe it's changed since October 7th, but I often think about it as there's this combination of there are the people who are actually malicious, like the Ben Gvirs and Smotriches of the world, and just want to punish and make people suffer in Gaza as much as possible and get them out of there. There is the people and the parts of the system that just don't really see Palestinians. It's almost like baked in, whether it's an inherent kind of racism or just, prejudice. And then there's just a dysfunctional bureaucracy sometimes that with a population that has zero political power, so no ability, if you're in the United States and you have a dysfunctional bureaucracy, even if you're in Israel and you have a dysfunctional bureaucracy, you have political power. You can vote those people out. You can apply pressure, and Palestinians have none of that. So in my mind, that's how I kind of describe it, but I don't know how you see why are we dealing with this problem?
Yeah. I think everything you said, all of the above. But I do think, it's important to realize on October 7th, the same day as these horrific attacks, Israel made a decision to stop entry of fuel, of water, of electricity, of all aid to the Gaza Strip. And it's never really made a decision to reverse that policy. I mean, we've seen with the ceasefire agreements, okay, now there's a decision, we're going to allow this aid to come in. There's pressure from the United States, we're going to allow in a bit more from Europeans. But not an internal decision to stop this kind of approach to the Gaza Strip of using aid as a weapon of war, of using it as a form of pressure. So I agree that, it's all of the above. It's a sense of vengeance. It's a sense of punishment. I think one thing that's really overlooked that people don't think about enough is that Israel also doesn't see itself as obligated to allow a higher standard of living in Gaza. From our perspective, Gaza's occupied territory. And like I started out by saying, Israel is in physical control. It's physically present in more than 50% of the territory. It has boots on the ground. It's harder and harder for Israel, I think, to make the argument that Gaza is not occupied territory. And as an occupying power, it actually owes higher obligations than it would if it were just, engaged in conflict with a region. And that means it needs to ensure a higher standard of living for the civilian population. As soon as it doesn't see itself as obligated to that, it means that it can allow itself to allow kind of just a minimal trickle of aid to go in. And it can look at the situation as it is now these days when the crossing is closed and say, we think there's enough food inside, so we don't need to allow in more. So I really think that people need to keep that in their minds and hold that in their minds. This is a whole approach that they have, that they do not have obligations to the civilian population other than a bare minimum.
So I'm going to ask you a couple more questions. One is, and these are a little bit more, well, this first one is a little more detailed. We've seen a lot of news about the Rafah crossing in particular over the last couple of months, negotiations on reopening the Rafah crossing, how many people are going in and out. You are going to be one of the people who knows this issue best. Frankly, I've not tracked it as closely as I should sometimes. Maybe dive in and tell us a little bit about what that was about and where we are now. Well, where we were before everything got shut down with the war starting.
Well, I know we don't have much time, so I'll have to give a really truncated version. There's a lot to say on this issue.
You could do a 45-minute session, breakout session for us just on this.
And I invite anyone who wants to learn more to visit our website, gisha.org. We have a lot of information there, probably too much. But Rafah crossing was reopened on February 2nd. So we all know the ceasefire came into an effect in October. And every few weeks, there were kind of news reports. Yes, their parties are in discussion, but Rafah crossing wasn't opened. It was opened on February 2nd, only for exit of medical patients and their companions, not for entry of goods. Goods do come in through Egypt, but via Israeli territory. We got to a point where less than 50 patients were coming out per day. And then, of course, Rafah has now been closed since the start of the operation in Iran. Rafah crossing is vital for people to have access abroad. It's also vital for return of Palestinians who are stranded abroad. There's over 100,000 Palestinians stuck in Egypt alone, let alone in other places. So people need to get back, people who got out for medical treatment who would like to return. But it's not a solution, right? The other crossings need to remain open. We need to see all of the crossing points open with Israel. And we need to see aid flowing and people moving back and forth. Aid and aid access for people is vital, both to the humanitarian response, to any kind of recovery. It's simply not, feasible that these crossings would remain closed.
And then another thing that we've seen since the announcement of the ceasefire 4 months ago, which I know some folks, I still call it a ceasefire because I see it as being so much more, we're in such a better place than we were then, but also while acknowledging it's not, there's still fighting and killing going on at significant levels. So maybe we need a new word for it. But we have had this setup of the CMCC, right, which is basically this coordinating center that has the United States and a whole bunch of international actors. A lot of humanitarian organizations are based out of there right now. Has that played a positive role, a negative role, a net neutral role? Tell people a little bit about that element?
Sure. I do want to start with the issue of ceasefire. And I mean, I agree with you. We really can't call it a ceasefire. More than 600 people have been killed since October. Over 1,600 injured. We're seeing airstrikes, pretty much every day. And of course, like I said, these ongoing restrictions on aid, of course, also on international organizations operating in the territory. So, I mean, I think that, what we can call it is occupation. It's occupation is a state of war. I mean, we're settling back into what we were before, which was horrific as well. In terms of the CMCC, people encourage me to be optimistic and to see that, at least there is another body in the room. The U.S. is in the room. They're seeing these policies up close for the first time, really. But, I have to say that the CMCC itself seems to me like a place where well-intentioned people gather, they discuss these issues, but the decision-making is not happening there. The decision-making is happening in, the higher echelons of the Israeli government, maybe a little bit in the American administration, but really the effect on the ground is the result of that decision-making. It's not what's happening at the CMCC.
All right. And so let's now move us forward. This is something we also talked a little about yesterday when we had our panel discussion, which is, where we go from here and, the Trump administration's 20-point plan, where you have a meeting with the Board of Peace where they're putting down proposals for a $50 million soccer stadium. And you compare that to what we're talking about here, where tent poles and basic goods and food, that's a massive disconnect, I guess, is the word I'm getting at, and at the same time, at least J Street's position has been, obviously if we'd written the 20-point plan, it would have had some different points in it, and there's some good things in it, and it's the only game in town. So we're going to support the elements of it that we think make sense and try to push it forward as much as possible because there is no other option right now on the table. And so, what does that mean for reconstruction, for humanitarian aid, for like how this all goes forward and how you would recommend all this going forward?
Yeah. Again, could be many hours. So, I think that we have yet to see what's going to happen after this escalation in the region. Frankly, I'm not terribly optimistic about where the cards are going to fall after all of this, and if we can just go back to where we were. But let's pretend that we do. I think that one of the important things to keep in mind about this whole process is that Palestinians aren't really at the table, and that this process should, from my perspective, be Palestinian-led. Palestinians know what they need to do. The UN and other INGOs who've been operating in the territory for decades, they know how to respond to the situation. They know how to stabilize the situation. And what we're seeing is that Israel and the US are sort of pushing these actors out. To me, that doesn't bode well. So I would hope to see, more, pressure, engagement in a way that we see a shift in this. I think also that we can't condition reconstruction on disarmament. To me, that's a key point here. We have to remember there are 2.1 million human beings living in the Gaza Strip. The vast majority of them have nothing to do with Hamas or with other militant actors. The majority of the population are children, actually. 50% of the population is under the age of 18, something like 70% under the age of 30. These people have a right to a future. They have a right to a dignified life. And so I think that we need to be moving forward on two tracks, on the political track to try to bring about a better situation for the region, and on the humanitarian track, to see these people, to recognize their needs and to be acting with full force to try to help them reconstruct their lives.
Yeah, and I think that's a very important point for us to wrap on, which is, and I couldn't agree more on the basic concept that yes, disarmament is important. Yes, we need a plan for Palestinian politics as well. Security forces coming in. There's a lot of complexity to the plans in Gaza that we've talked already a lot about at this conference, that J Street has written a lot about and will continue to. But the bottom line is, you have 2.1 million people there, and you have to figure out how to let them lead their lives and in a position where they can actually, thrive. And you can't start conditioning all basic needs of human beings on certain political steps that may or may not be taken or might take a really long time and are really complicated and sensitive.
And even beyond the morality question, I mean, we keep seeing this isn't working. Yeah. This isn't leading to better security or stability for anyone in the region.
Well, that is a perfect way to end, actually. And Tania, thank you for all the work that you do on this, and thank you for the partnership throughout the years and continued partnership. And to all of you who are watching us on Word on the Street live right now, we'll be back later today with additional sessions throughout the morning and afternoon. Wednesday. Oh, we'll be back at 9 a.m. We'll be back in like 15 minutes. I think with Amir Tibon and Yehuda Shaul, I believe, for that session. Israeli journalist who's really excellent on what's happening on the ground, and also wrote an incredible book about his experiences living in the Gaza periphery. And Yehuda Shaul is one of the world's real experts on what's happening in the West Bank. Thanks.